Second half of Session 7 of World Revolutions. We just finished talking about the historical background of Russia in terms of the revolution and looked at some of the factors that played a role in bringing about the end of the czarist regime in 1917, particularly the long history of autocracy, the vast differences in wealth, especially the suffering of working class people and peasants in the 19th and early 20th century, and of course the war, which helped trigger these factors along with the discontent of the intelligentsia or the middle class, all of these factors combining to create a condition in which by early 1917 Tsar Nicholas I was forced to abdicate. In fact, tried to pass on the position of Tsar to several of his relatives, but nobody really wanted the job. What was happening in early 1917 in Russia was not really an armed revolution so much as the disintegration and collapse of the czarist regime itself. After enormous losses on the battlefield, after the incompetence of Nicholas's rule and further exacerbated by the rule of his wife and Rasputin, there really was no strong basis of support for the czarist regime left in Russia as Russia suffered continuing defeat and losses on the battlefield. And finally, Nicholas had to step aside. In his place, there is an effort to use the Duma as the basis for a liberal regime to rule Russia. In other words, what is created in the place of czarist autocracy is something akin to a parliamentary form of government with a prime minister and a cabinet, and the Duma is serving essentially as a national assembly or a parliament. However, as you can well imagine, given the disastrous events that had struck Russia over the past several decades in particular, and the fact that there really was no set of existing institutions that had any real experience in liberal government. In other words, there was no history of the Duma having influence upon the regime and being able to exercise some kind of authority. And the chances of this experiment surviving were pretty slim at best. And indeed, as the months pass, workers in particular, as well as peasants, are unwilling to wait for the niceties of liberal government to be installed. What they are looking for is for immediate resolution of their problems. For example, workers are taking control of factories. They are going to assert their control over the factory system itself. They will manage their own workplaces in an attempt to salvage the economy and solve their own problems. There's a call for, and in fact, there's the beginning of a process of electing military officers. That given the incompetence of the czarist military, what we need now is a more democratic form of military administration where the soldiers will actually control the appointment of officers. And there is a call for all power to the Petrograd Soviet. Well, what does that mean? In Russia at this time, in these years preceding the revolution, no matter what the Bolsheviks or other groups might be doing, it was the workers themselves who were organizing to deal with the incompetencies of the regime and their own suffering. And one of the things that workers had done, not only in Petrograd but also in Moscow and in other locations, is set up Soviets. What Soviets were simply workers' councils. And these were often organized on a regional basis because the number of the factories were often located in the same location. So workers were organizing their own representative bodies, their own governing bodies, if you will, to manage the affairs of the workers and eventually the factories themselves. This had started well before 1917. Now, what the Petrograd Soviet is claiming, being so close to the seat of government, is that given the failure of the new liberal regime, this Duma-led government, to solve the problems of Russia, all power should go to the workers' councils and let the workers' councils run the country. This is an extremely radical demand that is being made at this point, but understandable in the light of the inability of this new so-called liberal, and by that I mean representative or quasi-representative body, to really exercise power and solve problems. Out in the countryside, peasants are taking matters into their own hands as well, seizing land. And it marks also the rebirth of the Mir, the representative council of peasant villages. Here we see a rebirth of peasant activism once again. And like the workers, as radical as some of this may seem, as they seize land and organize cooperatives to redistribute land in the ways that they had done in the past, in as equitable a fashion as possible, nevertheless, it is totally understandable in terms of the economic disasters that Russia had been suffering and the virtual collapse of government. If people do not take matters into their own hands, who is going to help them salvage their lives and salvage the situation? So much of what is going on is not being directed by any conspiratorial group, as much as the Bolsheviks would very much like to lead a revolution. Much of this is simply people saying, look, the government is collapsing. The new regime really doesn't seem to be accomplishing much. We're going to take matters into our own hands. We're going to control our own destinies. The Bolsheviks are anxious to lead this process, but in fact, much of what is going on is being done, you can't really say spontaneously because these are people. I mean, they're planning what they're doing, but it's being done very much at a local level and very much in response to existing conditions that people feel they have to get the situation under control. Now, Lenin, as leader of the Bolsheviks, is an extremely astute politician at this point. He recognizes what is going on, both in terms of the inability of the existing regime, the new regime under the Duma, to solve problems, and he understands the revolutionary actions that are being taken by workers and peasants on their own behalf. And he develops a very simple motto to appeal to people to try to put the Bolsheviks at the head of this process. And it's simple. He calls for peace, land, and bread. Peace, first of all, because the war is still going on. It was the belief of those who were leading the Duma, and these are people who include members of the nobility and the middle class, that they simply couldn't surrender to the Germans, that their new government would have no legitimacy whatsoever if they simply halted the war at this point after these enormous losses. So they had continued the war, even though the consequences under the Tsar had been disastrous and continued to be so under the new regime. So Lenin's saying, all right, enough is enough. Peace at any price, but we're going to stop the war. Land. Give the peasants land. That's what they want. They're out taking land now. That's what our government will do. It will assist them in redistributing land and bringing an end to the inequities in the countryside, the dominance of wealthy landowners and the czarist estates, and we will redistribute land into the hands of the people who deserve it, and that is the peasants themselves. And bread, meaning, look, we have suffered enormous losses as a result of the war. There have been starvation conditions in the major urban areas, and beyond that, this condition is, in fact, simply the most extreme version of the economic inequities that have existed in our society for so long. So we will have bread. In other words, there will be income, there will be sustenance for the working class and for peasants, for the popular classes in Russia. Very simple motto, and yet a powerful one because it summarized the basic demands of people in Russia at this time. There are all kinds of political and social philosophies flying around, but here Lenin is being a pragmatist and saying, look, we're going to give people, if we ever get into power, the three things that they want most. They want peace, they want land, and they want bread. And we're going to provide them. Now, it is often argued that the Bolsheviks were a small elitist group, and indeed they designed themselves precisely in that fashion. When they broke off from the Mensheviks in 1903, that was their purpose, that they were to be this small revolutionary cadre. But the reality is, on their road to power in 1917, they expanded rapidly, even though they were making this effort to keep the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party, as small as they could. The fact is their numbers were growing by leaps and bounds, from 24,000 in February of 1917 to 350,000 by October. So even though there was always this effort to keep the party pure, that it's got to be only committed Bolsheviks who are part of our numbers and part of the party, nevertheless, the reality was the party was growing by leaps and bounds because people were flocking to this message and believed that the Bolsheviks probably had the answers to the problems that afflicted Russia at this point. Perhaps the critical mistake that is made by the regime that succeeds the czarist government is the decision to continue the war, and specifically under the war minister Alexander Kerensky, when the Russian army launches what it calls its Galician offensive, the name for the region where the offensive was going to take place, an effort to deliver a blow to the Central Powers, to Germany, and hopefully create a situation in which Russia could finally extricate itself from the war. The offensive is a failure, and it convinces people once again that with this regime there will be no peace. There will only be continued war and probably eventually the destruction of Russia itself. These worsening conditions bring on new mass uprisings by both workers and by members of the military. In Petrograd, the workers go on strike, and at the Kronstadt naval base, sailors seize control of the ships. Here we have a mass mutiny occurring in the Imperial Navy, symptomatic of the worsening conditions. And this isn't just a simple mutiny. These people are raising the red flag of the Bolshevik cause. So they're not just saying, well, we're taking over, we're throwing off our offices. They're actually creating their own Soviets for the sailors. So they're actually trying to turn the Navy into a Bolshevik institution. So we see just how far the radicalization of these groups has gone when we see the rise of the Kronstadt sailors in July of 1917. In August, the government, now headed by Kerensky, the war minister who has now taken over as prime minister, faces a new threat when one of its generals, of course a general in the former czarist army, attempts a military coup, attempts to take power from the existing government, from Kerensky. In an effort to salvage the regime, with so much of the military at the war front still, and much of it in tatters, in order to try to defend the regime in Petrograd itself, Kerensky turns to the workers, and specifically to military units that the workers themselves have created, called the Red Guards. So Kerensky, in trying to survive, facing on the one hand an attack from the right when he faces this attempted military coup, now looks to the left, to the workers' Soviets and their military units, the Red Guards, to try to salvage his regime. But in late October, on October 25th of 1917, that strategy proves to be equally unsuccessful when the Red Guards storm the Winter Palace, the government palace in Petrograd, and seize it. This marks the taking of power by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks have put themselves at the head of the movement of workers' Soviets, and this is their opportunity. This is the time when they truly rise to power. It is now Lenin and his associates who rule Russia, as much of it as they can possibly rule, because most of the country is in absolute turmoil, and their authority does not extend very far east of places like Petrograd and Moscow. Nevertheless, Lenin is convinced that this is the moment of opportunity, that the time has finally come. He has returned to Russia. He and the Bolsheviks have been organizing among the workers in the Petrograd and other Soviets, and they have managed to take power. Now they have to try to hold on to it if they are to carry out their revolution in full. One of the first things that they do is to move on Lenin's promise of peace, and they sign an agreement with the Germans called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Basically, what the agreement does is pare away the western third of Russia. Much of what was Russia, here we can go back to our map again for a moment. If you see Moscow here, all of these regions west of Moscow were essentially being given away to the Germans as a way of securing peace. I mean, it was an extreme decision, and certainly under normal conditions never would have been done, and nor could any government have ever survived under normal conditions signing a treaty which gave this massive portion of the country away to a foreign power. But Lenin knew that there was simply no other way. If the revolution was going to survive, if Russia was going to survive, they had to have peace. They had to stabilize conditions within Russia itself. However, stability was not going to come readily in Russia after the initial rise to power of the Bolsheviks. In fact, for the next several years, Russia was going to be torn by civil war. Between 1918 and 1920, Russia is the scene of a massive civil war, pitting the whites against the reds. Now, in simple terms, the Reds, of course, are the Bolsheviks. They are the government in power. But the whites are a complex mix of forces. There is no such thing. With the Bolsheviks, you can understand that there is Lenin and Trotsky, and we'll talk about him in a couple of minutes, and several other key figures, and the Red Army. They are defending this new revolutionary regime. They are organizing, centralizing their authority. But the whites are far more disparate. There is no single white army. There is no single leader of the white forces. The white forces represent a complex array of groups. They include pro-czarist forces who want to restore the czarist regime. They include former military officers and military detachments who are simply using this as an opportunity to try to seize power for themselves. They include ethnic groups who have been burdened by imperial control from Russia for centuries. They're using this as an opportunity to rebel against that. It didn't make any difference who was in Petrograd or eventually Moscow running the show. These groups were simply looking to free themselves from the yoke of Russian imperialism, which had existed for so long. So you have ethnic groups and even regional groups that are fighting not because they are anti-communist or anti-Bolshevik per se. They're just opposed to Russian rule. When you look at the Soviet Union today, or the former Soviet Union, and see what happened when the communist regime finally fell and the Soviet Union finally collapsed, you had the series of breakaways of separate republics and groups, particularly along its southern and southeastern borders. This is exactly what was happening back in 1918, 1919, and 1920. Similar groups were fighting to assert their independence from Russia. So the whites are not simply, oh, those are the pro-czarist groups, you know, they want to get back into power. It's far more complex than that. And in part, that's an advantage that the Bolsheviks have. On the one hand, they're vastly outnumbered in terms of sheer numbers of troops, etc. But on the other hand, the whites are not a single organized force. They're a series of different groups. And even those that claim at times to be working together are often working at cross purposes and often fighting each other. So the Bolsheviks, despite their disadvantages, particularly the horrendous conditions that existed even at the time they took power and now the Civil War, are able eventually to defeat the white forces, but not before they face foreign intervention. The Allied forces fighting Germany and eventually defeating Germany were appalled by the Russian Revolution. France, England, the United States were fearful, first of all, that Russia's withdrawal from the war might prolong the war for years, but even more importantly, that what was emerging here was a revolutionary regime that it was adamantly anti-capitalist. I mean, this was a regime that drew inspiration directly from Karl Marx and was calling for world revolution, and indeed that's what they're talking about. They've organized the Communist International. It's an international committee to represent communist parties around the globe and to help promote revolution. So the Western powers try to influence the outcome of the civil war in Russia. They send troops there who allegedly are there to take arms back that had been given to the czarist regime. But in fact, this is just an excuse to try to intervene, if possible, on the side of the white armies and try to defeat the Bolsheviks. These attempts, however, end in failure, but they are a reminder to the Bolsheviks that, in fact, they are alone in the world at this point, and that all of the other major powers, specifically the Western powers like the United States and England, want nothing more than to see their destruction. This only reinforces the nationalist aspect of the revolution, that this may be a communist revolution designed to bring social, political, and economic revolution, but it's also a nationalist revolution. It's also a revolution designed to reassert Russia's independence, something that, again, the Bolsheviks see overtly threatened by the foreign involvement in the Civil War between 1918 and 1920. The Civil War also asserts the power of two institutions within the Bolshevik movement, namely the Red Army and the Cheka. The Red Army is, of course, the army originally created out of the Red Guards, out of the workers, Soviets, in the major urban areas, and then hardened and strengthened over the years of the Civil War. And of course, the Red Army's power and influence grows during the Civil War because the Red Army is critical to the survival of the Bolshevik movement. And in fact, one of the leading revolutionary figures, Trotsky, builds his power on the Red Army. He is the one who helps organize and lead the Red Army to its successes in the Civil War between 1918 and 1920. But in addition to that, created in this period of the Civil War is the Cheka, or in other terms, the secret police, the predecessor of what later became known as the KGB, the security forces, to defend the regime. So we get, at this stage, as the Bolsheviks fight for power, they already had this sort of idea of a small elite force that would lead the revolution. But now, in the process of fighting for survival, they create two powerful institutions which are authoritarian in their own right, the Red Army and the secret police, to help them survive, further giving impetus towards the idea that this is going to be a movement and this will be a regime which definitely rules from the top down. The Civil War also pushes the Bolsheviks into a series of measures which they later refer to as war communism, meaning that, yes, we're trying to create a communist regime but in a communist society, but these are drastic steps we're taking that we wouldn't normally take in this fashion except for the exigencies of war. And it's certainly true that it's hard to imagine more misery and suffering being visited upon one society than occurred in Russia in the years from the outbreak of World War I through the Revolution and then, of course, through the Civil War. I mean, the loss of life was mounting into the millions of people. The economy was virtually prostrate. There was hardly any economic activity to speak of in Russia by the end of the Civil War because whatever hadn't been destroyed on the western end of the country as a result of the involvement in World War I was being destroyed in these battles that constituted the Civil War. So the Bolsheviks feel that they have to take drastic measures in order to survive. They're going to have to seize control of the economy and essentially force it to work. One of these measures is nationalization of industry, to take over whatever heavy industry exists, because most of it's not going to function under these conditions. And most industrial enterprises were either owned by the government or privately owned, and often by foreign entrepreneurs. Well, in the midst of revolution and civil war, these people are not about to rush back in and invest money and start the wheels turning to produce goods, to get trains running and mines working again. That's just not going to happen under these conditions. So the government is going to step in and seize control of industry and force it to work, make sure it works to supply weapons, to supply the basic needs of the country. In addition, there is an end to free trade. In other words, the free operation of market forces cannot exist under these conditions. We essentially have to have a command economy where the government decides how goods are going to be used, who's going to produce what, where it will be transferred, and who will get to consume what. This is not unusual, by the way, because if you look at what the Bolsheviks did, it was not terribly dissimilar to what the Allies were doing during World War I. They were taking control of their own economies, not to this extent. I mean, there was not outright nationalizations, but in the United States, for example, they set up war boards of various kinds to control products. There was rationing of goods. The government gave you coupons, and that told you how much gas you got or how much food you got, etc. So these measures were very much in line with what other countries are going through at this time and what other governments are doing to survive. The Bolsheviks had an additional incentive. They had not only experienced the war and then the revolution, but now they had the Civil War on their hands. So taking control of the economy and having a directed economy from the government itself was not unusual, but it does set a precedent for the future. The third step that the Bolsheviks take is the requisitioning of grain, meaning they are not going to allow peasants to simply produce grain, produce food, and sell it as they choose. Again, the conditions are such that there are vast shortages, food prices are skyrocketing. The government is going to take over that part of the economy as well. And again, this is understandable to the extent that no free market system can possibly function under the conditions that exist in Russia as of 1917, 1918. But beyond that, there is a political message in this as well. The Bolsheviks are not opposed to and indeed engage in and encourage land reform, the taking of land by the peasants. And in doing so, they also begin a process of encouraging class struggle, what they would refer to as class struggle, in the peasant villages. Meaning this, that despite the dividing up of land into strips, etc., there were always, within Russia, a number of well-to-do peasants, people who were far better off than their neighbors in the village, who had land holdings. Remember, half of the peasant population, even in the days of serfdom, were free. And inevitably, some peasants managed to be more successful and others acquire more land, essentially have holdings that were independent of the mir and its control. And what the Bolsheviks set about doing is trying to essentially radicalize the peasant population, politicize them, turn them against the well-to-do peasants, arguing that they're as bad as the members of the nobility and the large landowners. They're doing the same thing. They're exploiting other peasants. They're the ones that hire you for a pittance to work on their land. So they're as bad as any other landowner, large landowner, or member of the nobility. So there is this effort to set one group against another, and indeed we see this process going on in peasant villages during the Civil War as the Bolsheviks seek to build a further base of support, specifically among the poorer peasants within the villages, saying, look, we're going to reorganize the land. We're not only going to get more land for you, but we're also going to see to it that some of this land comes from these better off peasants who have been exploiting you for years. So the Bolsheviks make a conscious decision. They're going to build a base of power among the poorer peasants in the countryside. With the end of the Civil War, by the end of 1920, essentially, there's no official declaration of the end of the war. It's just when most people stopped fighting, since there was no central opponent who could essentially capitulate and help declare peace. But with the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks are faced with the responsibilities of actually running the new Soviet Union. And you can understand the source of the name of the country, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Where did it come from? It came from the idea of the workers' Soviets. Here, as administrators versus revolutionary fighters, the Bolsheviks face enormous problems. The economy, as again you can well imagine, has been devastated. Much of the infrastructure of the country has been destroyed. Roads, railroads, mines that have flooded. The economy is essentially in a state of collapse. And initially, there is enormous impatience with the regime. No regime could possibly live up to the expectations of what people felt after the end of the Civil War. They'd been through so much. I mean, war, civil war had occupied the country ever since 1914. One of the signs of this deep-rooted discontent was a rebellion by the Kronstadt sailors. Now, here was a group that were held up by the Bolsheviks as revolutionary heroes. They had helped lead this uprising in the Navy to turn it into a series of Soviets, and yet now these people who were seen as revolutionary heroes were turning against the Bolsheviks for very practical reasons, because there wasn't enough food. The economy was sputtering. What was to be done? This uprising, as much as the Bolsheviks try to dismiss it, in fact sends a powerful message that they must bring about rapid change or lose power. Their solution is what's called the New Economic Program, or the NEP. And essentially what the NEP was a reversal of war communism. It was saying that, well, we're going to have to admit that the government is not going to be able to run this economy from the top down at this point. We have to free up much of the economy, allow private enterprise to work, and particularly peasants. They're concerned that the peasants be allowed to grow crops and respond to market forces, sell their products, if we're to get things going again. I mean, the government has virtually no resources, so how in God's name can they possibly run the economy? Instead, they have to free up as much of it as they can to hope to encourage particularly food production at this point, so that there will be economic recovery and they can try to hold on to power. In 1924, the movement loses the man who led it to power with the death of Lenin in 1924. And with his death, there opens a new chapter in the history of the Bolsheviks, and that is the struggle for power among the heirs of Lenin. Now, there were three contending figures in the Bolshevik movement. Actually, there are many more, but these are the three that are sort of the most prominent, struggling to take control of the Bolshevik Party and the new Soviet government. One was Stalin, who had been a longtime party member and had worked diligently through the years, working his way up through the ranks of the Bolshevik bureaucracy. Trotsky, who had joined the Bolsheviks fairly late, just shortly before the actual revolution in 1917, but who had risen rapidly to prominence because of his role in building the Red Army. And finally, Bukharin, who was another longtime Bolshevik, and who at the same time was probably the most ideologically innovative at this time of the three of them. He was, if you will, the ideologue, even though Trotsky later becomes known for his ideological precepts. Nevertheless, Bukharin was seen as perhaps the key intellectual of the group early on. These are the three figures who have the most likely claims to replace Lenin. And at first, of course, there is to be no replacement of Lenin. There is to be rule by committee. But in fact, what this means is, over the next several years, a struggle among these three figures to gain control of the party and of the regime itself. It is Stalin who will eventually emerge victorious out of this power struggle. With Trotsky, his advantage is that, again, Trotsky was a newcomer, and many of the old Bolsheviks did not trust Trotsky. They felt like, why should we put ourselves in the hands of this Johnny-come-lately, if you will? Not sure how that translates in Russian, but basically someone whose commitment to the party was of such recent origin. And eventually, Stalin is able to force Trotsky into exile. Trotsky will go into exile in Mexico and finally will be assassinated in Mexico by an agent sent by Stalin. Stalin continued to fear Trotsky as a potential rival, as someone who is trying to build an international base of power and as someone to whom his enemies might appeal in future crises to try to oust him. Bukharin, on the other hand, was a longer-term struggle. Bukharin's sort of Achilles' heel, his soft point, was that he was in charge, essentially, of the new economic program. So its success or failure would weigh heavily upon his reputation. And Stalin would use this because although the new economic program for a time helped revive the economy, it certainly got food production going again. Nevertheless, over time there were continuing problems in agriculture, and Stalin was able to use that to undermine Bukharin's position, arguing that he was unfit to rule because he was incompetent. Most of all, however, besides whatever steps he might take against either Trotsky or Bukharin, Stalin himself was an extremely astute politician. And I don't mean in the classic American sense of going out and glad-handing people and, winning votes, but in the sense of the workings of the party bureaucracy. He was relentless and full of energy when it came to building his position within the party. He would serve on committee after committee, and the party largely consisted of. This is how business got done in the revolution. As you might think of the example of the French Revolution with the Committee of Public Safety and various committees that operated in the revolutionary regime. That's how the regime in the new Soviet Union operated. And Stalin saw to it that he was on every key committee. And he saw to it that he was there at every meeting. And he would stay and stay. And these discussions and debates would often stretch into the night. A meeting might begin about what to do about the economy, and the debates might start late in the afternoon after people had finished their other tasks in administering the government, and run into the early hours of the next morning. Well, when most of his colleagues had finally given in to sleep and headed off for the night, Stalin was still there with a few close cohorts, and they would proceed to make the decisions about what was going to be done. He was very good at rewarding those who supported him, and at seeing to it that his supporters were appointed to key positions in the party bureaucracy. And through all of these techniques, Stalin built his power to the point where he finally became the absolute leader of the regime. Now, among Stalin's decisions in this period after 1924 was what he would call building socialism in one country. Now, this is not strictly just Stalin's decision. It's a recognition by the Bolsheviks that despite their dreams, that the Russian Revolution was just the beginning of a world revolution. And indeed, that's what they did hope and believe at the start in 1917, that it was clear by the late 1920s that that wasn't going to happen. Even with the collapse of the capitalist economies in the West after 1929, the reality was that there was no clear sign of a proletarian uprising that was going to sweep away the other capitalist societies of the world. And as a result, Stalin and the other Bolsheviks made a conscious decision that what they needed to do was turn in upon themselves and assure the survival and development of the Soviet Union rather than worry as much about the spreading of international communism. So their concern is to build a modern socialist state in Russia itself rather than worry as much about spreading communism across the globe. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't continue to maintain contacts through the Comintern with communist parties around the world, and were constantly looking for opportunities to spread revolution. But the fact is, the vast majority of their energies were devoted internally to Russia's own development. This becomes the critical focus for Stalin in the decades ahead as he continues his rule of Russia over the next 3 decades. This process was carried out through a series of what were known as 5-year plans, the first one being instituted in 1929. 5-year plans were not tightly structured plans for economic policy over a 5-year period. Instead, what they were a series of goals set out to indicate where the regime was going and really to try to energize people. As much as anything else, the accomplishments of what the Bolsheviks did over the next several decades in Russia has to do with their ability to capture the energy and imagination of people in the Soviet Union at this time. They were taking on a monumental task. Their economy had been devastated by war and civil war. Their economy, even before that, still was being dragged down by a grossly inefficient agricultural system and an industrial base that had just begun its real development in the decades before the revolution. And a good deal of that had been dislocated or destroyed as a result of the Civil War. So here they are with this society that had fallen far behind other economies and societies around the world. One that had been severely damaged by war and civil war. And now they're trying to not only overcome the losses as a result of warfare, but they're trying to make this a modern industrial power in a matter of a few decades. So the 5-year plans, again, are not these carefully structured plans, that we're going to do exactly this and exactly that. Some of the goals are far beyond anybody's being able to reach in any given 5-year period. But the idea was to capture people's imagination, that we can build this industrial plant, that we can quadruple the number of power plants in Russia in the next 5 years, that we can double the number of industrial, of steel factories in the next 5 years. The idea was to set goals and objectives towards which people could strive. And the plans proved highly effective in that regard. The focus was on heavy industry. To build iron and steel capacity, tractors, trucks, the kinds of heavy-duty equipment and industries that were needed to develop a modern economy. And in the process, Stalin moves the nation once more into the realm of war communism. They go back and readopt that model that they had used during the Civil War, at that time as a strategy for survival, now as a strategy for development. Stalin becomes convinced, and again, it is not just Stalin, but other members of the Communist Party, that the idea of allowing a mixed economy or a partially free economy to function simply will be inadequate to achieve the goals they have in mind. And others can look at capitalism and say, well, look at all that it's achieved in places like the United States and England and so forth, and the Bolsheviks would say, yes, and how many centuries did it take them to do that? We've only got a couple of decades to catch up to them. So aside from whatever strict ideological opposition they had to capitalism per se as followers of Marx, the other reality was we simply can't get this done through free enterprise in a couple of decades. We're going to have to go back to that command economy that we created during the Civil War in order to push forward with these goals. And indeed, this is what happens with nationalization of industry once again, complete nationalization of the economy eventually, where the entire economy is essentially controlled by the state. There is once again forced grain procurement and collectivization of peasant lands. Now, forced grain procurement, forcing the peasants to surrender their grain to the government, was not entirely new. It had been done by the czarist regime in a slightly different form and had been done during the Civil War. But collectivization was another issue. Here, in some ways, interestingly enough, the Soviets are going back to the czarist model that Stalin had adopted. But instead of saying, well, we need to consolidate land so individual peasants have one concentrated holding, the Soviets are going them one better and saying, well, we have to take entire village lands and consolidate them into one large estate. We have to turn peasant agriculture into a series of essentially agrarian industries, agrarian industrial plants. So we won't have a series of small farmers working this piece of land, that piece of land. We need these huge operations in which the peasants will work collectively, just as industrial workers work collectively, to raise crops, because this is the most efficient system possible. And it, of course, also lends itself to the Marxist ideas about collective action, about people cooperating and working together. This became one of the most contentious issues in the Soviet Union in the first half of the 20th century, was the mass collectivization of peasant lands. In some areas, it worked effectively. After all, there had long been a tradition of collective work within the peasant communities. Remember the idea of dividing up land according to people's needs, so that no one person got all the best land, working it in strips. This encouraged people to help each other because they worked right beside each other. But at other times, there is violent opposition to the collectivization, as we will see. So during the 1920s and 1930s, what Stalin is doing is creating a series of collective farms, both for practical economic purposes and to achieve rapid economic growth, and at the same time the idea that this is the basis for a true communist society, where people work cooperatively, where there are no individual owners of property, but rather people working collectively. In some ways, the Soviet system does indeed try to achieve Marx's ideals in terms of not just collective work, whether it's through workers' Soviets or collective action on the farms, but by creating a social safety net. In Russia, employment, one way or another, would be guaranteed. Education would be free. Health services would be free. Housing would be free. Now again, how much housing can the Soviet regime supply in the 1920s, 30s, and so forth? They're always woefully inadequate. But the ideal is being created. What the Soviets are attempting to do in the decades after Lenin's death in 1924 is to both push Russia into modernity, with a modern industrial plant, a modern economy, highly industrialized, efficient agriculture, but at the same time, to achieve that, to provide to people the basic necessities of life, to achieve the same material goals achieved by capitalism, but to try to do it without the same uncertainties and inequities created in a capitalist order, by assuring people of the basic necessities of life and by promoting collective action. However, no matter what Stalin and the Bolsheviks may have dreamed about achieving, the fact is that much of this was going to lead to acute resistance, especially in the countryside. One of the most striking events of the process of collectivization is what's known as the Great Famine, which occurred between 1932 and 1933, and with casualties that are estimated somewhere between 3 and 4 million people. Now, this topic remains a highly controversial one in terms of what actually happened in this period in Russia. There are those who claim, well, Stalin knew all about this and he deliberately failed to send food into areas where famine existed, where there had been crop failures, in order to destroy people who were resisting collectivization. Because indeed there was significant resistance to collectivization, dependent upon which region, which part of the country you were talking about. There are others who argue that the famine is the fault of the Soviet policies, but that it was largely the result of incompetence and inefficiency by the Soviets in the attempt to carry out this drastic transformation of Russian agriculture in an incredibly short period of time. that what happened in so many cases is that collective farms would be created, but of course people were then trying to hoard their own resources and not contribute them to the collective farm. The local administrators were uncertain how to secure those resources, and then when trouble began, when there were shortages of fertilizer and seed, etc., they were afraid to report them back to the central government for fear that they would be held responsible. Wherever the truth may lie between the various versions of what happened, the fact is this was a disaster that visited the Russian countryside in 1932-33, and certainly was rooted in the disruptions created by the process of collectivization. But more than that, it is also true that the Soviet regime cracked down sharply on those who did resist collectivization. They were seen as enemies of the state. And it is also true that between the famine that occurred and the harsh treatment of those who resisted collectivization, that a mass migration occurred in Russia in these years of the 1920s and 30s. Specifically, some 10 million people moved from the countryside into the cities in this period between 1928 and 1932. It is one of the most dramatic migrations from rural to urban setting that has ever been seen, because we're talking a period of 4 years, 10 million people. Clearly, this is a product in part of the Soviet process of collectivization that was being vehemently resisted by portions of the peasant communities. But it was also a product of the fact that, in truth, there had long been poverty and suffering in the Russian countryside. And now, with the tremendous emphasis placed upon industrialization, jobs were being created at a rapid rate in the major urban centers, and not just in existing urban centers. Across Russia, if we go back, let's look at the map again for a moment to get an idea of the enormity of this process. When you look here at all of these major urban centers stretching all the way across Russia, okay? Throughout the land, they were creating new industrial centers, including in Siberia. There was a major effort to recapture Siberia, sort of the Russian frontier, if you will, and to industrialize all across Russia, to run railroads, to exploit natural resources, to build steel plants, iron plants, factories, all across this vast land, so that new industrial cities were springing up on the plains of Russia out of nothing, essentially created by government fiat. These were creating magnets to attract millions of people into urban centers when new opportunities were created for employment. So we have both factors working, both the disruption of the countryside because of collectivization and the resistance to it, the famines that occurred, but at the same time we also have a magnet force which is drawing people in, because here is the opportunity for a better life. Here is an opportunity for industrial work that is better paying and hopefully more secure than what people have experienced in the past in the countryside itself. Something else that occurs in this period is what I call here proletarian promotion. There is no question that a dramatic social upheaval occurred during this phase of the revolution. Specifically, what we see is 1.5 million workers who become white-collar employees. This in itself is a dramatic social revolution. Most of what is happening here is that workers who joined the Soviets, in other words, the workers' Soviets, the workers' councils, who joined the Bolsheviks, wind up moving up into the government bureaucracy, whether it's bureaucrats running the state system, bureaucrats within the Communist Party, officers in the Red Army. There is this mass promotion, if you will, of 1.5 million people from the ranks of the working class up into the various apparatus of the Soviet state, military, and the Communist Political Party. This would become a vital base of support for the Bolsheviks in the years ahead, or the communists by this time, because here were people who really could speak to the revolutionary change that had been brought about, that they had been simple workers at the time of the revolution, and now they might be officers in the military, senior bureaucrats, leading party officials, an enormous number of people who found their road to opportunity opened by the revolution itself. So we have a series of jarring changes that are occurring in the new Soviet Union in the decades after Lenin's passing. We have this massive program of industrialization, collectivization, the famines, the urban migration, the promotional aspects of the proletarian experience as 1.5 million workers move up into the Communist Party bureaucracy and other aspects of state administration. And we have at the same time this attempt at a social experiment that suggests that a society can modernize and industrialize while at the same time trying to minimize the day-to-day uncertainties and inequities that have existed through the process of capitalist modernization by saying, well, we're going to assure people of work, we're going to assure them of health care and education, we're creating new job opportunities in the middle class for working class people. These are the two critical aspects of the Soviet Revolution in the first half of the 20th century, to try to bring rapid modernization and at the same time to ensure the security of the population by providing the minimal needs of life, assuring people of opportunity and of food, of jobs, of housing, even as this radical industrial revolution, this radical revolution of modernization takes place. How successful were they? At a minimum, as we will see, they are successful in modernizing the Russian economy, at least up into the 1940s and 50s. On the other hand, as much as they try to assure the population of a security that did not exist in the early stages of capitalist development, the human costs of this experiment proved to be enormous. Now, by 1934, Stalin was ready to declare the revolution was over, that the mission had been accomplished, that in fact success had been so extraordinary that Russia was now entering a period of stabilization and institutionalization. And in some ways that is understandable when you look at the economic achievements of the Soviet Union in these years. When you see steel output up by 50%, iron up by 100%, coal by 100%, just enormous increases in the economic capacity and productivity of the Soviet economy in the years after the Civil War. And this was a tremendous leap forward, as Mao might have called it. Here was a society which, despite its efforts in industrialization, which had been rather focused on the western regions of the country, and which had been severely undermined by war and civil war, and a society in which agriculture remained primitive at best in terms of its productive capabilities. Here was a society that indeed had undergone a radical transformation in terms of its economic development. And these figures speak volumes about just how much the Soviets accomplished in a very short period of time. It would be hard to find another example, China maybe, we'll look at China later on in the course, where one society has moved so rapidly from one end of the economic spectrum to the other. At the same time, collectivization was essentially accomplished by this time. The agricultural system had been collectivized, as Stalin had hoped. And in 1936, a constitution was written that provided for the right to vote and the end to class differences. So a constitution, whether it was ever actually carried out in its full terms is another matter, but a constitution which declared the basic kinds of rights that one would expect in a modern society. So here in 1934, 1936, there appear to be the signs that the revolution has essentially reached its point of stabilization and has achieved these tremendous accomplishments in terms of economic development in such a relatively short period of time. And yet, this declaration of the end of the revolution and of stabilization and of these great accomplishments was to be followed by some of the worst violations of human rights that would ever be witnessed in the Soviet Union itself. So just at the time when it looks like Stalin's ready to declare victory and we can all take pride in what we've accomplished, and now we're just moving forward progressively with a series of 5-year plans onto a prosperous socialist future. It's just at this time that now the system turns in upon itself and begins to purge its own members. From 1936 to 1938, the Soviet Union was the scene of what are called the Great Purges. Now, it's important to note here that the Bolsheviks had periodically, during their history, engaged in purges. Again, going back to their basic concept about what they were about. They were supposed to be, a relatively concentrated group of professional, dedicated revolutionaries. And down through the years, both prior to and immediately after the revolution, in the 1920s, for example, purges occurred where people had to come forward as party officials and explain themselves, justify what they had done in the past year, and where they could be questioned by committees about whether they were in fact fulfilling their roles. And just about any member of the party could and would be reviewed for their performance and dismissed from the party if it was believed that they weren't showing the right dedication, commitment, what have you. So the tradition of purges existed, but nothing on the order that takes place in the 1930s. Now, the party is going to undergo a massive purge, and one which will lead to the extermination of a significant number of figures within the party apparatus. In fact, it will seriously weaken the government and the military because so many people will be sentenced to long jail terms or executed because they are found to be enemies of the state, found to be trying to undermine the Communist Party. For the more prominent members of the party who face these accusations, there are a series of what are called show trials, meaning that, yes, we'll hold a trial and then we'll hang you. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. People had already been essentially browbeaten into making confessions. The purpose of the trial was really so that the regime could demonstrate these people are in fact guilty. Because watch, they're going to come to this trial and they're going to confess their crimes and they're going to implicate others. This is precisely what took place in Russia at this time, with a number of party officials forced to both confess to their own crimes, real or imagined, and to implicate others. Sounds like the McCarthy era here, but it was on a much grander scale. And huge numbers of these people will face sentencing to long, if not lifelong, terms in prison camps, known as the gulags, many of these located in Siberia, the far reaches of the Russian wilderness, where prison camps were set up and hundreds of thousands of people were sentenced to these camps for their alleged crimes against the state. 700,000 people will be executed as a result of the Great Purges. Again, some of this can be explained in terms of the past traditions of the Bolsheviks themselves, of purging members who were found to be unfit, found to be insufficiently dedicated or ideologically committed to the party. But, of course, past purges had not meant mass executions or imprisonments. Here, we have to look at the reality of the Soviet Union in the mid-1930s. As much as Stalin could point to the accomplishments of the Bolshevik Revolution up to that time in terms of the economy and the tremendous gains that the economy had made, and as much as he could look and turn towards the social policies of mass education and building housing, etc., the reality is that the Soviet Union was isolated internationally. As much as the Bolsheviks had dreamed of international revolution, nothing of the sort had occurred, and the communists found themselves isolated in the world. They are surrounded by enemies. This is the time, of course, of the rise of fascism in Germany, the rise of the Nazi Party. But even without the Nazis, the British and the Americans were dedicated to isolating, walling off the Soviet Union and hoping for its eventual defeat or destruction. The British, for example, in giving free rein to Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, did so not so much because they were weak or ignorant. It's just that as long as Hitler wanted to march east, which meant eventually confronting the Soviet Union, it was fine with the British. They were hoping, in some ways, that Hitler would finish off Stalin and the whole communist experiment. In light of these kinds of threats internationally and the sense of isolation, Stalin turned inward to once again purge the party and try to ensure the absolute loyalty of the population, of the party and the military, to ensure the survival of the regime. And finally, the third explanation is simple political expediency on the part of Stalin. Whatever he may have been trying to do in terms of eliminating people who were deviating from the official Soviet line, who were potential defectors, who might be disloyal to the regime, above and beyond that, there was the simple fact that he was eliminating political enemies, those who had questioned his leadership, his rule, people like Bukharin, who would be swept away in the purges. Above and beyond the tradition of purges within the Bolshevik regime, above and beyond the international isolation and fear which certainly existed in the Soviet Union at this time, the third factor was indeed Stalin's own political expediency, that he would eliminate many people simply because they were not loyal to him personally, not because they were not loyal to the Soviet regime itself. Looking at all of this in terms of causes, goals, and effects of this revolution. First of all, in terms of causes, the revolution has as one of its fundamental motivations something that we have seen elsewhere, particularly in Mexico the last time we looked, but also in earlier regimes, and that is a weak centralizing state. In other words, a state that is trying to consolidate power and at the same time modernize. Now, when I say weak, you might say, well, wait a minute. You said earlier that you had this incredibly autocratic regime in Russia that, no ruler possessed more power than the czars of Russia. They really didn't face the kinds of challenges that the French king did from the nobility's palments, etc. Absolutely true, but weak in this sense, that the roots of the regime within its own society were weak. In other words, what the czars had built over the years was a regime built on absolute rule from the top, dependent upon a nobility and the military, and upon this ability to go on expanding as a military force, this is the basis of rule in this society. But as far as popular support within this society, the middle class, peasants, the proletariat, all of these groups had fallen away from the regime over time. It had little, if any, basic popular support within this society. This is what we mean by weak, is that a lack of a base of support within the society itself. And yet, this regime, despite its limited connections within its own society, is trying to carry out a process of modernization which is inevitably going to be disruptive of the society as a whole. Remember what happens to the peasants. They get their land consolidated. They're going to pay the price of modernization under the czarist plans. Workers see these huge factories rise, but the working conditions are miserable within them. So these people see themselves being dislocated. Peasants are paying the price of modernization, and to a lesser extent, so are workers. So they're trying to modernize, but in trying to modernize, they're also setting off and exacerbating the discontent which exists in society as a whole. As a triggering mechanism, there is the war. There's no question that the war helps bring on the revolution at this given moment in 1917. Now, to say that there wouldn't have been a revolution without the war, I think is totally false. It simply ignores the deep-rooted problems and discontents within Russian society. There had already been one revolution that hadn't gotten that far in 1905. And in 1914, before the war breaks out, we see the general strike by the Petrograd workers, and we see a whole series of uprisings that mark the period between 1905 and 1917. So it's not as if the revolution wasn't going to occur anyways, but the war, the disasters of the war, helped bring it on at this time. Third factor is foreign modernization. Here is a factor that helps promote popular nationalism among workers. That this isn't just an issue of Marxist ideology. This is a belief that it is foreigners in particular who are the source of the suffering of these workers in the large urban areas. So it gives an element of nationalist fervor to this movement as much as anything else. Not as strong as what we saw in Mexico, but nevertheless a factor as well. That it isn't just that you're exploiting us, in other words, the czarist regime, but that you're bringing in foreigners who are allowed to exploit us. Where is the protection that was so essential to the role of the czarist regimes of the past? You used to defend us from, Mongol hordes, etc. Why don't you defend us from these foreign capitalists who come and exploit us now? Marxism provides a potent ideology that addresses some of the key concerns of the Russian people in these years. As far as goals, the elite want to preserve autocratic rule while modernizing. And the czarist regime itself is the clearest indicator of that. They want this autocratic system in which the czar is essentially all-powerful and rules over all without question, while at the same time trying to create a modern industrialized society. For workers, it is both socialism, a more equitable and just society than they have experienced in the new modern workplace, and nationalism, an assertion of Russian nationalism, in part because of their experience of subordination to foreign investors, foreign capitalists. For peasants in particular, it's restoration of peasant communities, of the life that they once knew before the various modernizing efforts of the czarist regime. It is ironic, of course, in the end that the revolution will bring further disruption of the old peasant communities and the old peasant order, and that the Soviets will do much of what the czarists were trying to do, which is modernize and build much of the modernization process on the peasants. The legacies of the revolution. Clearly, this is the first successful socialist revolution and sets the stage for a decades-long struggle between socialism and capitalism. In fact, many of the other revolutions we'll look at are part of this same process as other societies choose socialism as their road to modernization. And it is clear that, indeed, the Soviets try to create not only a modern society, but one in which there is greater social and economic equity than under a capitalist system. It becomes a revolution that promotes anti-imperialism and nationalism. What do I mean by anti-imperialism? In other words, foreign domination. That's what the Soviets see as imperialism. The fact that Russia would subordinate itself to foreign powers for the sake of national development. The Soviet Union also takes as one of its leading goals and impacts developmentalism. The very fact that they could achieve rapid economic growth and industrialization in such a short time. Russia becomes the standard bearer for progressive forces in the world, for societies seeking to modernize and industrialize and create some degree of social equity. That is the essence of the Russian Revolution, an attempt to modernize a society but create more equitable conditions than under capitalism. But the contradictions remain, because despite these idealistic goals of modernity, of material well-being for its people, and social and economic equity, what results out of this revolution is collectivization of land against the will of much of the peasant population and a totalitarian regime which deals harshly, brutally, with much of its own population. The human toll is enormous. Much as in the French Revolution, we see that empowering the state to an absolute degree to carry out revolutionary ideals can often lead to extremes that violate human rights and the human spirit. These are the contradictory legacies of the Russian Revolution.